me start where you ended because, it is true. A budget resolution can be a means for laying out a plan. It's got several, as you know, serious defects. Number one, we don't control policy. And so we can lay out numbers that go as instructions to the appropriators and to the Finance Committee, how much money to be raised, how much money to be spent. We can't tell them how to do it. So that's especially difficult on the revenue side of the equation because we can say to them, raise more money, but we can't say to them, reform the tax code in a way that actually lowers rates. And so that creates a challenge. The second problem with the budget resolution is typically budget resolutions, as you know, are for only 5 years. The vast majority of budget resolutions have been for 5 years. We really need a 10-year plan. And where we're not limited to 5 years, it's almost always been the case. The third big problem is the budget resolution never goes to the President for his signature. The budget, as you both well know, is purely a congressional document, and I personally believe that without the President at the table, we are not going to get a resolution to this problem. So it is an imperfect way of taking on this problem. I personally believe what we need is a summit that involves the President, leadership of the House and the Senate, Democrat and Republican, to come up with a plan that will become law and will be signed by the President. Clearly, he's got to be at the table to negotiate. A couple of other things that have been said here that I think I need to respond to. There are some who believe on this committee that TARP and stimulus had no value. I don't agree with that.
What?
Stimulus and TARP had no value. I don't agree with that. I believe, as Alan Blinder, the former co-chair of the Federal Reserve, and Mark Zandi, the head of Moody's, have concluded that without those two, we'd likely be in a depression today. I believe that. I believe without the two, unemployment would not be 9%, unemployment would be 15%. That's what their study concluded. And I believe without the two, we'd have 8 million more people unemployed in this country than we do today. TARP, of course, was begun under the previous president, not under this president. I was in the room when his Secretary of the Treasury, President Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve told the leadership of Congress, Democrat and Republican, that if we did not act, there would be a financial collapse within days. I will never forget that as long as I live. And I believe the evidence they provided to us was persuasive. So I believe those steps had to be taken. Clearly, they added to debt in the short term. I have always been a deficit hawk. I've always believed deficits matter, and I believe it even more today. So the problem that we confront is, what do we do going forward? All of the bipartisan commissions have concluded the best course is not to have sharp cuts right now, but to put in place a plan right now that does profoundly change our trajectory over the next 10 years. That's what the Fiscal Commission on which I serve concluded. That is the conclusion of your commission. I think that is the right conclusion. That it is not a matter of sharp cuts in only 12% of the budget this year that are going to get us back on course. What is required is a comprehensive plan that deals with entitlements, that deals, yes, with domestic discretionary spending, but also with defense spending. And I want to ask you about that now. In testimony before the Fiscal Commission, the testimony was that 51% of all federal employees today are at the Department of Defense. And that does not count the contractors. Dr. Rivlin, I don't know if you were in the room when these defense analysts testified, but when I asked them, well, how many contractors are at the Department of Defense, their testimony is, we can't tell you.
No.
I asked them, well, is it a security matter? No, not a security matter. We really don't know how many contractors there are. I said, can you give us a range? They said 1 to 9 million is the range. Now, I have supported my career, I've been on this committee 24 years, I've supported every penny requested by every president for defense, every penny. But after the testimony that came before the commission, we also see what the Secretary of Defense is doing now. He has talked about 50% of the expenditures of the Department of Defense are overhead cost. You concluded, the President's Fiscal Commission concluded, defense cannot be off the table. Could you tell us why you concluded that?
Let me start with the last question. And we concluded that, along with many members of our task force and experts that we talked to, as well as the experts that we both listened to at the Simpson-Bowles Commission, that there's a lot of waste in the defense budget. And over the years, just like in the domestic budget, we've accumulated a lot of programs, a lot of weapon systems that often the Secretary of Defense didn't propose, but Congress wanted to perpetuate because they caused a lot of jobs to be retained in the particular places. And there is a potential, as Secretary Gates has said himself, for improving the efficiency with which the Defense Department operates. And he has proposed some of those reforms. So we listened to all this and decided this was really possible. We have a very large, effective defense establishment, far greater than any other nation, and threats change. But we believe that we can have a very effective and strong defense if we pare back some of the waste and some of the lower priority spending.
All right. Might I say, actually, this task force worried more about this issue than any other. We had outside consultants come in, tell us, and particularly to show us how it might be done. Not that we were doing it, but what the numbers were, and our numbers were a fixed number, and it's frozen to that for the period of time prescribed, multi-year. And we asked, what would it look like in terms of manpower, the various big ones, and obviously they said, we've got to find ways to cut personnel, because personnel is a very expensive part of the federal defense budget. They showed us ways to save under their proposals, and this group of very adult people, they're people like a former president of Kellogg Corporation, former Secretary of Commerce, who's not going to vote for something that's going to destroy our defense. I was of the opinion that if we went through all this trouble to save our country and we lost our defense, we would be fools. So we ought to try to do both, save our defense and save our country. And we think there is room. These numbers will hurt for a while on defense, but if they know, they can tell you more than anything else. If you tell them positively what their goal is for 2 or 3 years, they're the best at reaching it of any department in government. So if you told them, here's the number, and that's what the hard freeze is, it's there for 4 years, they would just have to live with it. I think they could. Contrary-wise, if you cannot use them to get more savings, is here we got to get domestic savings, but look, we did defense also. If we don't have that, we lose a real a pitchfork that helps us get others to go along with cuts in other parts of the government.
Let me ask you this question, and then I'll turn it over to Senator Sessions. You know, we have people who tell us, look, you shouldn't touch revenue because this is purely a spending problem. And I would be the first to say we got a spending problem because spending is, as a share of GDP, the highest it's been in 60 years. On the other hand, revenue is the lowest it's been in 60 years as a share of GDP. That tells me we've got a problem on both sides of the equation. But what would you say to those who say, No, you can't touch the revenue side.
Well, there's probably no one that went to a task force such as this worried about the impact of trying to achieve our goal on the future of our economy, to make sure we aren't killing our vitality as we do this. And I am not impressed with those who say they know absolutely positively how much tax is enough for America and what is too much. You can look at history, all right, and say it's never been above 21% of GDP, but the truth of the matter is you don't know what number is absolutely right. And we are entering a period where we have an exceptionally large, because of demographics, exceptionally large group of Americans entering the entitlement era for both Social Security and Medicare. I mean, the graph is here now. We're getting that very big build-up, and it appears to me in order to take care of them in a reasonable manner, and you've got to change the program and bring down the cost, but even then, we can't get by without some revenue increase if we want to have less bonds being floated out there to be purchased by other governments and other people. So that's where it is, and I don't remember our percentages, but we're off the mark. If you stand firm on the historical number of 19 to 21, we're off that by some, but I'm convinced not enough to harm America's economy for the future, and that's how I did my thinking.
And let me ask you a final question, because some say don't touch revenue, others say, well, don't touch entitlements. I tell you, I've heard loud and clear from people who say don't touch entitlements. You did. You reformed entitlements.
You bet.
What do you say to those who say don't touch entitlements?
Well, I'll just give you a sentence. She knows more about the details. I'll just say it's impossible to take the largest portion of a budget that's growing very, very rapidly and not address it in some way to save revenue, to save expenditures, excuse me. How can that be that the largest component is left unscathed? That's the starting point. And then you just have to look at it and see, can it be? And I think Alice says, yes, it can be restrained, and she'll tell you how.
Dr. Rivlin?
I think the answer to why you can't do it without taking entitlements on is simply, as you look ahead at the projections, the entitlements, but particularly the medical care entitlements, drive up spending faster than GDP can grow and faster than revenues could possibly grow.
Right.
If you don't slow the growth of entitlements, then you have to raise taxes continuously. It's not just once. You have to raise them continuously to keep up with the fact that entitlement spending is on track to grow faster than the GDP. Now, how much can we restrain entitlements? We know that it will be very difficult to slow the growth of Medicare enough so that it doesn't drive out everything else. We must reform Medicare to slow the growth. Like Senator Domenici, I'm not convinced that we can slow it enough to get back on a sustainable track without more revenues. But that's the dilemma. How much can we slow the growth of health care entitlements and to some extent Social Security? Can we slow it enough so that we can pay for it without revenue increases? I don't think so.